Good afternoon. Welcome, Rosalind Donald.
Thank you
You're
so much.
Assistant Professor in Communications at the American University. And today we will be discussing Open Access Week, which this year has been themed Open for Climate Justice. And you have done some research on climate justice in the Miami region, and you have published with us on that topic. And we would really like to hear from you. What does climate justice actually mean?
I think climate justice to me is related to thinking about environmental justice. And that's a theme that was pioneered to really draw attention to the ways in which certain communities enjoy much less access to environmental amenities, neglect, and then also they're designated as sacrifice zones. So they may experience much more pollution from industrial facilities, which are more likely to be sited near them. There was a lot of scholarship that came out of the United States looking at the effects of segregation on Black communities and then other communities of color, but then also we can see it as a global phenomenon. And I think when we're looking at climate justice, that really helps us to frame it because it's a phenomenon. It draws attention to the fact that the most vulnerable people, often the people who have done the least to contribute to climate change, are experiencing its worst effects. But it also highlights histories of exploitation of people and nature. So it's there has been a tendency to look at climate change in more of an ahistorical way, or to look at it sort of beginning with the Industrial Revolution. But if you connect it with these histories of exploitation, then you can see that climate change is more of a symptom of histories of exploitation than simply a standalone phenomenon that has to do with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's a through-going symptom of global systems of exploiting people and nature.
Yeah, it's a serious problem, and we see this inequality of who's affected by climate change throughout the world, but we also see it in research. Can you expand on that?
Inequality is baked into academia itself. Who gets to be a researcher, who is able to stay. We talk about a leaky pipeline of grad students going through to becoming practitioners, and I think that that's also a huge problem. The types of knowledge that are valued in academia aren't always. Local knowledge is not always valued, but it's exploited. So you may have. There's a real danger that you're working with a community and using their knowledge, but kind of not necessarily. There may be community members who feel like they haven't been cited, who their knowledge is being used, but they're not recognised. And then finally, yes, access to the research itself, which can help communities to advocate for themselves. As I found, and I think that a lot of people find when they're working in the space of environmental justice, is that the communities know very well what's happening to them, and they know why. The thing that researchers can contribute to it is often producing knowledge in a format that is accepted in different forums where communities may sort of frontline communities may be more marginalized.
What can we do as listeners to support a fairer distribution of the burden of the climate crisis? I know it's a broad question.
And I mean, because it's such a through-going problem, there are many routes uh, to think about sort of greater fairness and justice. Um, I think you can sort of participate in many ways. You can join local environmental justice groups. I also think sort of thinking beyond the boundaries of what environmentalism has constructed to be nature, I think is really important. So thinking about nature in the city, thinking about nature in communities that have been sort of cast as urban or polluted. I think sometimes there's a tendency to almost count them out. Um, and so, if you are part of an environmental group, it's asking what's being done to contribute to environmental justice. And I think that you can almost do that in any capacity. I was thinking about how because it's something that we may think about only in one kind of category, but you could be asking your local cricket club what it's doing to contribute to environmental justice, and they're the kinds of conversations that can you know start to spark connections for people that may not otherwise be obvious, and help us to think more holistically about how justice, uh, thinking about our relationships with nature can kind of come out of the silo and actually think about our existence as community members more
Yeah.
generally.
And that sort of brings us to the next question. Your research, you've looked at how narratives are shaped around climate justice or about climate policy, and what have you found?
Mhm.
What are the most powerful elements that shape these narratives?
So with the research that I did in Miami, I noticed that people were talking about climate change in very, very different ways, and sometimes almost completely at cross purposes. And one of the biggest divides that I noticed was, whether or not uh, was down the lines of segregation, and so it also has to do with people's experiences of environmental injustice, um, because environmental injustice also has to do with the fact that at a local level, some people experience greater environmental quality at the expense of other communities, and then that also connects with where people are living. So at the time, sort of in the 1920s, 30s, when these kind of displacements began, it was uh, wealthy communities wanting to take over the central business district, but also denying access to coastal areas. Miami's very segregated, but you see most white communities are on the shoreline, and then black communities are on higher ground inland, and then in Miami you see then Latinx communities kind of expand south and west, and these areas all experience climate change in different ways. Um, so on these sort of high ground historic black communities that had experienced displacement, people were talking about climate gentrification, which is sort of a relatively new concept, but it has to do with researchers noticing that house prices were going up proportionately more in high ground areas than on the shoreline, and that also very much connects with this historic experience of environmental injustice, and so people would people are connecting that history to the climate problem. Um, but when you speak to officials, they're thinking potentially more about sea level rise and uh, sort of problems that are sort of increasing now and affecting perhaps sort of higher income areas.
if you had a choice, would you publish your research open access, or would you publish your work not open access if you had the choice?
I would always publish my work as open access, given the choice, because it enables anybody who is working on environmental justice, working with different communities, to be able to access that research without necessarily having a subscription to a journal. And so, for my part, I think there are many different ways that I, as a researcher, can try to make my work accessible. I also try and write it as clearly as I possibly can, for example, and I think it's also important to think about different kinds of formats that you can publish in as well. Not just as a journal article, but also, how can you kind of distill the main points of your research and make them as accessible as possible. But making sure that it's available to people, not just in Miami, but hopefully all over the world, that are trying to think about how to have these conversations about climate change at the local level, where policy and governance is now really emerging as a necessity, because communities are experiencing more and more extremes now, and we find that those extremes are unequally distributed. And so I think that being part of the open access movement is really exciting, and I hope that it also allows us to think about you know, new ways of doing scholarship that are community led.